Jasmine Crockett shut down by Pam Bondi. Total collapse on live TV Capitol Hill buzzed with anticipation. What began as a segment titled Immigration and the Future of America soon escalated into a national flashpoint. Representative Jasmine Crockett, appearing live on CNN, delivered a remark that would echo far beyond the studio walls. Crossing the border isn't a crime. This was not a misquote, nor a paraphrase pulled from social media discourse. It was a direct assertion made by a sitting member of Congress. The tone was poised, the delivery intentional. Crockett spoke with the confidence of someone standing firm in their convictions. Her remarks expanded beyond legality into a moral framework. Undocumented immigrants, she argued, are not taking from the system but supporting it, even calling them the silent backbone feeding this country. But it wasn't merely her words, it was her phrasing that drew immediate attention. One line in particular, "We done picking cotton," carried cultural weight, delivered to emphasize the perceived exploitation of immigrant labor. The statement was met with a quiet that wasn't reverent, it was uneasy. In the studio, producers hesitated. On the internet, reactions exploded. The moment went viral almost instantly. Hashtags surged, videos were clipped and shared, and Crockett's supporters amplified the message across platforms. Yet while social media echoed with praise, another audience was watching, quietly, and with a different reaction. Pam Bondi, the sitting U.S. Attorney General, observed the broadcast, not with outrage, but with professional concern. She wasn't preparing a response rooted in political opinion. She was preparing to revisit federal statute. From her office, Bondi turned to her team and gave a simple instruction: pull up 8 U.S. Code 1325. I want the entire statute printed, not summarized. The moment had moved beyond rhetoric. It had entered the realm of law. While social media wrestled with memes and trending hashtags, a far quieter, but far more consequential, response was already in motion. At the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi wasn't crafting a tweet. She was assembling a case. After viewing Representative Jasmine Crockett's televised remarks, particularly her assertion that illegal entry into the United States isn't a crime, Bondi's demeanor remained composed. There was no dramatic reaction, no raised voice. She didn't dispute Crockett through opinion or media appearances. Instead, she called for documentation. Specifically, Bondi requested the full text of 8 U.S. Code 1325, a federal statute outlining penalties for unlawful entry into the country. She wanted it printed, not summarized, along with Social Security contribution records spanning 5 years. Her intent was clear. If someone sought to reframe federal law as a matter of interpretation, she would let the actual statute speak. By dawn, Crockett's remarks, including her statement, "We done picking cotton," had saturated digital platforms. The quote, though positioned by Crockett as symbolic, was quickly repurposed. It appeared in memes, in commentary, even in political response videos. The narrative twisted and splintered. To some, she had voiced a harsh truth. To others, she had overstepped into rhetorical danger. Within hours, conservative media picked up Bondi's quiet reaction and gave it amplification. Her video response was simple: a cup of coffee beside her, law books behind her, and a direct message to the public. When a sitting member of Congress tells the country that entering illegally is not a crime, she said, she's not misinformed, she's misleading. Bondi clarified that undocumented labor was not a contribution in itself when it arose from legal violations. The law, she said, was not optional based on political framing. By midday, her clip had amassed over 1.9 million views. But this wasn't just about public perception. Inside the halls of Congress, the House Judiciary Committee convened privately. Crockett's remarks were under scrutiny. The committee chair placed a call directly to Bondi. "Pam," he said, "we're holding a hearing. On the record, we need clarity, and we need it from you." Bondi didn't hesitate. She didn't ask who else would be there. Her response was short, firm: "I'm not coming to teach law. I'm coming to teach truth." Behind the scenes, arrangements moved quickly. The hearing would be public, streamed, and heavily attended. Reporters began requesting access. Staffers prepared documents, anticipating legal confrontation. Social media feeds overflowed with anticipation. Crockett's supporters called it political persecution. Her critics called it accountability. By the time the hearing was officially scheduled, the tone had shifted nationwide. This was no longer a debate confined to a CNN appearance. It had become a legal and cultural touchpoint. The ideological tension between enforcement and empathy, between rhetoric and statute, was no longer theoretical. It was headed for the record. Inside Capitol Hill, the hearing room took shape with unusual urgency. Microphones were tested. Seating charts were adjusted. The witness list was finalized. And at the center of it all were two names: Representative Jasmine Crockett, who had declared illegal border crossings to be non-criminal; Attorney General Pam Bondi, who would publicly challenge that statement, with federal law as her witness. The hearing wasn't being set up for drama, but everyone involved understood the stakes. Crockett had made a claim on national television that touched on immigration, race, labor, and legality, all in one sentence. Bondi, in contrast, would bring statute, precedent, and data. As the date neared, Crockett prepared for the confrontation with characteristic poise. She crafted talking points, engaged with media, and shaped the narrative as one of advocacy for exploited workers. Meanwhile, Bondi remained largely silent, focusing instead on documentation, legal definitions, and clarity. Two approaches, one chamber, and soon a national audience. Outside the legal circles, momentum built. Bondi's quiet video had done more than clarify the law, it had recalibrated the conversation. Even moderate and independent outlets began to cover the upcoming hearing with measured tones. For once, headlines weren't about scandal, they were about statute. Inside her office, Bondi reviewed cases of immigration law enforcement, labor violations, and precedent. She anticipated the rhetorical moves Crockett might use: appeals to emotion, framing through injustice, references to historical trauma. None of it would be dismissed, but all of it would be met with clarity, because the law, as Bondi understood it, had to cut through the fog of interpretation. As the night before the hearing approached, both camps finalized their materials. Crockett's staff prepared language centered on dignity, economic contribution, and moral responsibility. Bondi's team stacked federal records, immigration law codes, and case studies. There would be no mediator, no commercial break, no applause track. Just an open hearing, and two fundamentally different interpretations of what it means to speak truth in public office. Pam Bondi didn't rehearse. She didn't need to. Her plan wasn't about winning the internet. It was about reestablishing a legal baseline that, in her view, should never have been in question. And so, as the hearing room lights dimmed the evening before, Capitol Hill braced itself, not for political fireworks, but for something more rare: a conversation between emotion and evidence, between rhetoric and reality, between a microphone and a law book. The hearing room at Capitol Hill was full before sunrise. Every seat, every aisle, every corner had been occupied by staffers, press, aides, and a few invited constituents who had become symbols in a story far larger than themselves. The air was thick, not hot, not cold, just charged. There were no raised voices. No one needed to be reminded that this wasn't just another policy discussion. This was political gravity. Representative Jasmine Crockett entered first. She wore the calm of someone accustomed to public scrutiny, her posture upright, her gaze steady. Cameras followed her from the hallway to her seat. She waved briefly, nodded toward familiar faces in the audience, and settled in with the kind of confidence sharpened by media cycles and national exposure. To the public, she had become a recognizable face. To her supporters, she was principled. To her critics, provocative. And to those undecided, she was now a focal point of legal and ideological conflict. But if Crockett had entered the room with a familiar rhythm, the atmosphere shifted when Attorney General Pam Bondi walked in. There was no wave, no visible acknowledgement of the press. She moved with deliberate precision, a file tucked under her arm and a steel gray suit that signaled purpose, not performance. Her heels echoed briefly across the floor before she took her seat opposite Crockett. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The chairman opened the hearing. His remarks were procedural, but his tone carried weight. They were not here to conduct a partisan battle. They were here to clarify public understanding of federal law. Crockett had made remarks on national television. Bondi had contested those remarks using statute. Now, the public record would be corrected or confirmed. As the session began, Crockett took the floor first. Her tone was polished, familiar to viewers of primetime political interviews. She framed her earlier comments within a broader moral and economic narrative. "I'm not here to apologize for the truth," she said. "I'm here to speak for those who remain invisible, who contribute to this country but are criminalized for existing within it." Her words drew a quiet nod from aides in the back row. A few murmurs flickered across the gallery. Her message was impassioned, rooted in a defense of undocumented workers and the structural inequality they often face. Pam Bondi didn't interrupt. She didn't jot notes. She waited. When given the floor, Bondi rose and moved slowly to the whiteboard that had been placed beside the witness table. With calm deliberation, she uncapped a marker and wrote two terms: misdemeanor and civil infraction. "Representative Crockett stated publicly that illegal entry is not a crime," Bondi began, turning to face the room. "That is not just inaccurate. It is dangerously misleading." She pointed toward the statute printed behind her, 8 U.S.C.O.D.E. 1325. The law was read aloud in full, line by line, with the relevant clause underlined on the projection screen. "Any alien who enters or attempts to enter the United States at any time or place other than as designated shall be guilty of a misdemeanor." Bondi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply let the language speak. The room absorbed the moment in silence. There were no objections. Crockett remained composed, but her eyes flickered momentarily, not in fear, but in recalculation. What followed was not a confrontation. It was a contrast. Bondi focused on the distinction between facts and beliefs. Her tone never shifted toward aggression. She framed her argument with methodical clarity, explaining that when lawmakers present personal opinions as legal realities, they undermine the very structures they claim to defend. "It is not abstract, it is not poetic, it is printed, it is public, and it is federal law," Crockett responded. She didn't dispute the statute's existence, but redirected attention to moral dimensions. Her position, she clarified, was not that laws don't exist, but that society should question the justice of those laws. "We can't pretend that statutes, by their existence, are automatically just," she said. "Undocumented immigrants contribute over $100 billion in taxes. They pay into Social Security, they build the homes we live in, and clean the rooms we sleep in." The room listened closely. Her argument was familiar, but impassioned. She invoked labor dignity, generational struggle, and institutional blindness. And then, a question, direct and provocative: "Which of you," she asked the committee, "is raising your children to clean hotel bathrooms or pour concrete in 110-degree heat?" There were no verbal replies, only a shift in posture among lawmakers. Some looked at their notepads. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Even the press seemed to hold its breath. Bondi allowed the moment to sit. Then she moved forward. "You just use society's discomfort," she said quietly, "as a shield to defend systemic exploitation." Her words didn't echo. They landed. She then introduced a real case, not a hypothetical, not an abstract reference. His name was Luis, a 23-year-old undocumented worker. He had lost 2 fingers in a construction accident. No insurance. No legal recourse. No voice. "That's what your 100 billion buys us," she said. "Labor with no leverage. Compliance at a discount." The chamber stilled. Crockett folded her hands. Her expression remained strong, but something behind the eyes had shifted. The response wasn't immediate because it couldn't be. Pam Bondi continued. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened. "We can't keep mistaking silence for gratitude, or survival for consent. This is not justice. It's organized exploitation." When Crockett finally replied, it was not to refute, it was to defend her rhetorical intent. That phrase, "we done picking cotton," was a cultural reference, she said. It's about historical trauma. It's not about literal labor. Bondi didn't challenge the symbolism itself. She challenged its usage in this context. "Progress isn't measured by how clever our slogans are," she replied. "It's measured by whether we can see injustice when it's dressed in new language." The hearing continued in this rhythm. Rhetoric met with statute. Symbolism met with case law. moral appeals countered with documented realities. What made the exchange so significant was not the volume, but the weight. Neither participant attempted to grandstand. They simply offered two fundamentally different readings of the same American dilemma. And the room, filled with lawmakers, media, and ordinary observers, didn't flinch. It recalibrated. The hearing wasn't about theatrics. It was about precision. And by the time part three of this unfolding confrontation reached its conclusion, one thing had become clear. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a test of whether truth, as written, could still hold its shape under pressure from truth, as felt. What began as a legal hearing had, by now, taken on the weight of something far more profound. It was no longer just about statutes or headlines. It had turned into a national reckoning, an unscripted moment of moral examination disguised as a procedural exercise on Capitol Hill. Attorney General Pam Bondi, still standing at the whiteboard, didn't press forward with new charges. Instead, she returned to the core distinction that had anchored her argument from the beginning: legality versus rhetoric. Turning to Representative Jasmine Crockett, she posed a quiet but inescapable question. If someone works full-time, risks injury, and receives less than fair compensation, what do we call that? Crockett didn't respond immediately. Her eyes dropped to the notepad in front of her, but whatever talking points had been written there no longer seemed relevant. The moment had shifted, and with it, the gravity of what was being asked. Eventually, she replied with a defensive but controlled response. That's a flaw in the system, not the fault of immigrants. They're doing what they must to survive. Bondi nodded, but her expression didn't soften. She replied without raising her voice. No one said it was their fault. But what you've just described isn't a flaw. It's exploitation. That word exploitation hung in the air like a slow-forming verdict. Bondi stepped back, letting the room absorb the weight of her point. Then, instead of citing another statute, she reached into her folder and removed a piece of paper. It wasn't a policy memo or a graph. It was a story. Real. Personal. His name was Luis, she began. He was 23, undocumented, worked in construction. One day, a beam collapsed and crushed his hand. He lost 2 fingers. No insurance, no rights, no voice. Her voice never cracked. She didn't embellish the details. She didn't have to. When I met his cousin in the hospital, Bondi continued, the only thing he said was, at least we still got the paycheck. The words didn't explode across the room. They settled quiet, irreversible, painful. This wasn't a media debate. This wasn't political theater. This was a courtroom without robes, a confession booth without absolution. A legal proceeding had become an ethical interrogation of a nation's conscience. Crockett remained poised, but her hands, once animated, were now folded. Her expression hadn't collapsed, but it had dulled into something more contemplative, less combative. She wasn't losing the exchange in terms of performance, but something behind her demeanor was adjusting, and Bondi wasn't finished. You want to ask this committee how many of us are raising our kids to scrub toilets, she said. Let me ask you, Congresswoman, how many of us are okay raising a country that survives on the backs of people? It refuses to acknowledge, unless they're on a tax spreadsheet. No one interrupted. No one interjected. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle sat in silence, not because they agreed, but because there was nothing clever to say. Then, with restrained force, Bondi delivered a chilling historical parallel. In the antebellum South, slave labor was praised as economically necessary. It was framed as unfortunate but productive. Today, we say underpaid migrant labor is regrettable but essential. The rhetoric changed. The system didn't. The chamber was motionless. Even the press gallery, so often the first to exchange knowing glances or type snappy tweets, stopped. Pens hovered. Phones stayed lowered. Crockett shifted in her seat. Her jaw tensed. She tried to respond not with statistics this time, but with symbolism. The phrase I used, "we done picking cotton," was about progress, she said. It's cultural. It's about how far we've come. Bondi listened, then answered with a line that cut through layers of rhetorical insulation. Progress isn't measured by clever slogans. It's measured by whether we can still see injustice when it's repackaged as opportunity. What followed was no longer a debate. It was a test of clarity. Crockett raised her voice slightly, hoping to shift the energy. You don't understand what it's like to represent people who've been ignored for generations. You don't get to police the way we speak truth to power. Bondi's tone stayed even, steady. You're not speaking truth to power, Congresswoman. You're distracting power from truth. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was strategic. The room had recalibrated once again. Bondi pivoted, not toward further prosecution, but toward a reframing of responsibility. You can't preach emancipation while defending servitude. You can't cry liberation while justifying labor systems that thrive on fear and invisibility. Her words didn't accuse, they revealed. Then came the visual shift. From the second row, a man stood. He wasn't a lawyer, politician, or lobbyist. His name was Dave Timmons, a general contractor from Arizona. At Bondi's invitation, he stepped forward. He didn't read from prepared notes. He didn't offer spin. He told the room the truth. I've hired undocumented workers, he said. A lot of them. Why? Because they work harder, they don't complain, and yes, they're cheaper. His voice didn't shake until he mentioned Mateo, a 17-year-old boy, who had died after falling from scaffolding on one of his sites. No papers, no protection, no record. Mateo had died in Timmons' truck before help could arrive. He died invisible, Timmons said, and the system didn't flinch. He looked at Crockett directly. His words weren't harsh. They were honest. They don't need to be called heroes. They need laws that protect them. Then he looked at the entire room. We built this country on the backs of people nobody wanted to look at. I know. I helped do it. But I won't keep building on top of silence. When he sat down, there was no applause. Not even from those who agreed with him. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of conflict, of uncomfortable clarity. Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. Even the press gallery had stopped recording for a moment. Not out of reverence, but out of respect for what couldn't be compressed into a headline. The room didn't shift back into debate mode. Because part 4 of this story wasn't about who would win the hearing. It was about whether the system could still hear itself when no one was speaking. The hearing had not ended. But something inside it had. There were still scheduled questions, prepared statements, and closing remarks ahead. But in the aftermath of Dave Timmons' story, about a teenage worker named Mateo who died on a job site without insurance, documentation, or even a name in the federal system, no one in the chamber wanted to resume politics as usual. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat still. The vibrance that once animated her voice, the rhetorical flair that had defined her television appearances, both had faded into a silence that wasn't performative. It was personal. She wasn't conceding defeat, but she was absorbing the weight of a truth that could not be offset by applause or reframed through ideology. Pam Bondi, across the aisle, didn't follow up with another argument. She didn't summarize her points or restate the law. She simply turned and pointed to a seat near the front of the room. Mr. Timmons, she said softly, thank you for your honesty. There was no follow-up, no applause, just quiet acknowledgement. The hearing chair cleared his throat, his voice catching ever so slightly in the transition back to formality. Let the record show that testimony has been given under oath. The House committee will now move to ethics review and consider the legal ramifications of statements made by Congresswoman Crockett. There was no need for dramatics. The procedural language, ethics review, carried enough political weight. Crockett didn't protest. She didn't request additional time. She simply adjusted the mic in front of her, then let it go. The red light on the recording feed was still blinking. Even now, millions were still watching, but the energy had shifted. This was no longer a story of who could deliver the sharper line or the stronger media soundbite. This was something heavier. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the ripple effects began. The House Ethics Committee officially launched a review into Representative Jasmine Crockett's televised remarks, specifically her claim that crossing the border isn't a crime. Pam Bondi's closing statement, quiet, measured, and grounded in federal code, was clipped and shared online. It reached 18 million views in just 2 days. Influencers, commentators, and even mainstream outlets began reshaping the conversation. Where once there had been unquestioned praise, there was now cautious distance. Even CNN, the network that had originally aired Crockett's Urban Hour segment, quietly replaced the archived episode with an editorial correction. There was no dramatic headline, just a quiet swap. as if hoping no one would notice. But people did notice. And not just because of Bondi. They noticed because a moment of moral conflict had pierced through the noise, not by accident, but through clarity, through law, through lived experience. Crockett, for her part, did not issue a formal apology, nor did she double down, but she did step down from the immigration subcommittee, a move interpreted as both strategic and symbolic. At a rally in Georgia, Bondi's closing words were projected across a 30-foot LED screen. Her line, "You don't defend justice by muffling the law," had become more than a rebuttal. It had become a message, repeated across social media with cinematic edits and patriotic backdrops. And when former President Donald Trump took the stage that evening, he didn't start by thanking the crowd. He started by thanking her. "Pam, you did what the Democrats haven't done in 2 terms," he said. "You told the truth, and you didn't apologize for it. The crowd didn't cheer, they erupted." And just like that, a new slogan appeared on red baseball caps: Law, Truth, Orders. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the cameras stopped rolling, but the consequences remained. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the Capitol elevator alone. No staff, no reporters. Just her and a single flashbulb popping from across the hallway. She didn't offer a statement. She didn't need to. The story had already written its final paragraph. Somewhere far from the noise, Pam Bondi sat behind her desk, reviewing a new case file. There were no celebratory photos, no interviews lined up, just another folder, another day, another statute to interpret and enforce. Because for her, this hadn't been a victory. It had been a correction. Back in the Capitol chamber, chairs were being stacked, mics powered down, and the red light on the live stream, the one that had tracked every word, every shift in tone, every sharp inhale, finally turned off. No music played, no hands clapped, but something had changed. Not the law, not the politics, but the conversation. What had started as a televised remark about immigration had become a confrontation between two versions of truth, one framed by narrative, the other anchored in statute. And for once, it wasn't the loudest voice that prevailed, it was the clearest.